hide, for example, in gold or silver. Have a nice day. Whatever currency system we end up with has a 90% capital gains tax on your gold. And oh, by the way, if you can't prove what you purchased it for, the basis is zero. So just hand over 9 of every 10 units of currency that you transmuted into, which effectively means you did not protect your wealth. So again, the risk of this degenerating very quickly from an economic crisis into a political crisis where there is a loss of confidence in the government, and from there some very ugly and scary things, is quite real. I hope that doesn't come to pass. The closer we get to this cliff and the longer we keep playing this game with deficits, though, the higher the probability goes, because the damage that is done by into the economy by doing this is compounded. Back in 2000, my estimation was that we had to take about a 10% contraction in total GDP in order to clear the system along with the excess credit. In 2007, that number, just on a back-of-the-envelope calculation basis, was about 20%. Today, it's about 30%, and at some point it becomes impossible to sustain, and you get a self-sustaining spiral on the way down, and essentially gross domestic product goes, for all intents and purposes, zero, because the only thing that you have is the farmer that can grow food for his own consumption and barter or trade off whatever he has in excess, which, by the way, is not the big corporate farm, which doesn't have any fuel to operate on in order to plant their crops. We're talking about the guy that has 40 acres out the back door. That's going to become a problem too.
Okay, thank you. And in the very unlikely event that the government can actually get its act together and start to do the right thing, however you may define this, could you lay out the best case scenario as to how the government might be able to gracefully deflate the current bubbles?
Yeah, I think what you do is the first thing you do is you cut off the deficit spending. What I have put forward is a total cessation of deficits on an instantaneous basis would essentially be like setting off a hydrogen bomb in the middle of New York City in terms of impact. So that's clearly not a rational thing to do. But what you could do is you could say, we're going to take $500 billion out of the deficit this year, we're going to take $500 billion out next year, and we're going to take whatever is left to get us to a $100 billion primary surplus in 2013. The market would treat that as being very credible, provided it was real and it couldn't be fudged. The result of that would be a very sharp move upward in the dollar. It would force a cessation of a lot of the deficit spending that has gone on an immediate basis. So at the same time, you need to do two things. One is that you have to pull back from the foreign protection that we're providing in places that are not linked to our supply of energy. And that means a major cut in the Department of Defense. But you cannot, as many people want to say, there's so many people that want to just pull out of Iraq, Afghanistan, basically walk away from everything related to energy force projection. We cannot do that, folks. We are today paying $200 a barrel for imported oil when you take a look at what we are actually spending in terms of DOD spend per barrel of imported petroleum. The price is not $100 billion or $100 a barrel, it's $200 a barrel. We need to redirect that into U.S. consumption and U.S. production capacity. We can't stick straws in the ground. We need a better plan. I've put one out there that involves using thorium as an energy source and coal as the feedstock. It is viable. It works. We know how to do it. It will require funds, but we can shift Defense Department money into that and fund the ramp that way. At the same time, we have to take the medical system. We have to throw both the physicians' networks and the drug and device makers to the wolves. Today, we have a system that relies on a law called EMTALA that was passed in the 1980s. It says that if Juanita, the illegal immigrant, comes across the border, 7 months pregnant, been doing drugs the entire time, walks into a hospital and poops out a baby that it then ends up in the NICU, that the American taxpayer has to foot the bill not only for the delivery but also for the $1 million worth of care that child requires. We cannot continue to do this. We also cannot continue to live in a society where we have people that are of elderly age that have made no provisions for their own care that then have a quadruple bypass and 2 new artificial hips. I understand that people say, well, you can't throw grandma down the stairs, and I get that at a social level and at a level of compassion. But the fact of the matter is that we can write checks with our medical technology that we cannot cash with our pocketbook, and we have to bring those two things into alignment. What that's going to mean in the short and intermediate term is that people are going to have to grow up and deal with their mortality. And it's a nasty subject to broach, but we have to have an adult discussion about this as Americans. We haven't been willing to do it on either side of the political aisle, and it has to happen now. We can get there. We will have to absorb a 20 to 25% contraction in GDP over the short term. If we do that, I would recommend immediately sending every illegal alien home, regardless of what we have to do to accomplish this, because we should allow Americans to have those jobs before we give them to other people. And for those who say that Americans won't do them, I'll point it out in Arizona, where they had a Chinese restaurant that had hired a bunch of illegal Mexicans. They busted them, they sent them home, and voila, all these people were willing to cook food for $7 and $8 an hour because it was better than zero, okay, which was the alternative that they had. So we do have people in this country that can fill those jobs. We need to reform the tax system. I happen to be an advocate of the fair tax, but it's not the only path. And like I said, we need to fix the medical system. We do those three things, and you trash all these big banks. You force them to eat their cooking. You deflate the debt. It's going to detonate the five biggest financial institutions in the United States will all go bankrupt. The only possible exception is J.P. Morgan. I've done the math on this. I'm convinced they will all go under. It's okay. No depositor will lose any money. The FDIC will not get tapped. The bondholders will get destroyed. That's the way life goes. We have to take this pain is coming. It's Jesus did his thing on if you're a Christian over well, in fact, last night, right? And they nailed him up on a tree, and he said, I got to do this. From taking this hit and from doing the right thing comes renewal. We fix the tax system, we fix the medical system, we get the excess debt out of the system, the leverage goes away, and we have an economy that's sustainable. But we are going to end up with an adjustment downward in American standards of living. There's no way around this.
Okay, thank you. Now for a somewhat darker question. Could you lay out the worst case scenario that you would envision, and what would be the events that would be likely to foreshadow it?
Well, the worst case scenario is that we break something overseas and we get this adjustment that I've described, but we don't do it on our terms. We don't have the discussion with the American public. It just comes and hits us in the face. The most likely place this originates is either over in China or, God forbid, we start a war over in the Middle East through some mistake. The possibility that the Saudis get involved in some sort of massive civil unrest and the oil gets cut off would certainly be sufficient to trigger something like that. The consequence of that sort of a event would be a likely doubling of oil prices in the space of hours. And the consequence that flows from there is a almost immediate shutdown of the interstate transportation system that provides the food, fuel, and everything else. We would have to direct the military in some form or fashion to keeping those routes running. We have a fair degree of fuel storage and things like that in the short term, but the disruption that would come from doing this in a disorderly fashion would be extreme. The idea that we could just cut off all of the government spending without having a conversation about it first and without politicians being willing to stand up and be honest with the American people, I'm afraid the shotguns would come out. And, the problem with angry mobs is they tend not to look towards the people that actually caused the harm. They just do crazy, nutty things. You look at what happened out in L.A. when with the Rodney King situation. These people have this ability to become animals, and I am not looking forward to that sort of a circumstance at all. Once it gets going, it's going to be very hard to stop and control.
Okay, thank you very much.
Karl, many forum members are of the opinion that most of the financial problems stem from a category of institution we classify as corrupt bastions. Among these are the Fed and the banksters. For our first question in this topic area, we'd like to turn to Giuseppe. Giuseppe?
Okay, Carl. As you have said prior in some of the YouTube shows that I've seen, the shenanigans of the Federal Reserve, the Treasury, and all their Wall Street friends using our money to cover their losses. If this ever comes to be understood by the public in general, then I would think game over. The credibility of the Federal Reserve would be completely shattered. The printing of money will stop. Debt will not be issued against our tax dollars. I then see a system grinding to a halt. If you agree with the simple scenario, what would you advise be going forward?
Well, I think there's a very real possibility that happens. I don't understand how anybody takes Ben Bernanke and the Fed seriously at this point, to tell you the truth. I mean, the man has literally been wrong about essentially everything he's ever said, but yet people continue to listen to him. At some point, this will change. I would say that the most important thing to have in that sort of circumstance would be a reasonably secure place to live, B, the necessary tools of whatever trade you are good at to be able to reestablish commerce in the way that it ought to be done. In other words, you may go and push paper today, but if you know how to fix people's tractors, that would be a very useful skill in a time like that. And then have, not have claims outstanding by other people. So my general advice has been, number one, get out of debt if it is at all possible to do so. Certainly get out of any kind of debt that can be called or cranked against you in terms of interest rate and terms, i.e. credit cards and things like this. And secondly, look at what it is you would need to have to establish yourself as having economic value in the world, to the world in general. And there may be, things that you can do today to do that. I think there will be a great opportunity during this process if we have that kind of a thing becomes underway, where you'll be able to, let's say that you're a machinist, you know how to run a lathe and a CNC machine. You'll be able to pick these things up at a tiny fraction of what you would pay for them today. This kind of a thing happened during the Depression, and it is the way that you find long-term wealth. It won't make you rich quickly, but it will put food on your table, and ultimately it will be the way that you're able to prosper. But you need to be able to take advantage of those opportunities when they arise, and you don't know when they're going to happen. My internet company, to a large extent, came out of this. We had a nasty little short recession in the mid-1990s, and it was an opportunity for me to pick up a lease on real estate that we could have never afforded had we had to pay anything close to retail rates for. So these kinds of things come up from time to time.
Okay. Well, other than skills or skill sets that people would have, do you think maybe a different type of form of currency would be viable in this type of event?
Not particularly, because governments, when they undergo this kind of situation, have a habit of stealing anything they can get their hands on. And if you think you've avoided it, you're probably wrong. You can always attempt to diversify into other currencies. The problem is the government can always come after you with capital controls and capital gains taxes. And I hear people say, well, I'll just barter and I'll deal in the black market. And my answer to that is that if you're comfortable with committing acts that the government may define as felonies, then that's certainly fine. But then again, I can say the same sort of thing to somebody who says, well, I'll just stick up convenience stores. At the end of the day, if you go to jail, none of this does any good, right? So I